Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Wolf. I am co-director of the Thomas International Center in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. And we've just had today a wonderful series of presentations on Flannery O'Connor, the great Southern Catholic writer. And this afternoon, we're going to be having a panel discussion of the different people who participated. Ralph Wood is the University Professor of Theology of Religion and Literature at Baylor University. Bill Sessions is Regents Professor of English at Georgia State University and the official biographer of Flannery O'Connor. And Christina Bieber-Lake is Associate Professor of English at Wheaton College. So let me start off the discussion by, I know that both Ralph and Bill actually had a chance to meet Flannery O'Connor. And I want to ask you, what's your most striking memory of her as a person, especially insofar as that might intersect with your understanding of her as an author?
Well, I will go first since my meeting was very short. She made her only visit to Texas. And of course, Texans are proud of everything that we can claim to be unique. In 1962, in the autumn of '62, November, only 2 years, less than 2 years before her death, I was in such great awe of her, I did not walk up and glad hand her, I must confess, and make sure she knew who I was. I stood back and watched and listened. But what struck me most about her, she both read a short story and gave a version of some aspects of the grotesque in Southern literature, was her enormous self-confidence about what she was doing. By that I don't mean arrogance, that she was convinced that no one had ever done this before, but she had a sense that she had been given a gift, our word this morning, that she had a talent, that she had perfected a craft, for which she was both thankful on the one hand and confident on the other. The one question I remember most acutely is when a student asked her, quite idiotically, "Miss O'Connor, why do you write?" Her answer was, "Because I'm good at it." So, C.S. Lewis says in the Screwtape Letters, not to be proud of one's own work when rightly and well accomplished is false humility. That one should be as grateful and thankful for what one has done as he or she would be if someone else had done it. And she had that gift. Interesting.
Bill, what about you?
Well, I knew her from Ascension Day, 1956. And then I didn't see her again, but on August 4th in New York, I got a telegram from her mother saying that she had died the day before in 1964. So there was a widespread, and a lot of it is in the letters, and I have other letters too that have come out. But Flannery, of course, was calm. I mean, she was subdued, and she was not always very polite and very lighthearted, for that matter, and very funny. And we had great jokes we told together. That was the main thing. Herman Talmadge, of course, we called Hummin, but then everybody called him Hummin. But we had a bishop, a Catholic bishop. He was then from Savannah, and then they moved him back. And he was okay, but he had, I made up a name for him, and she liked it very much. I called him Aunt Pitty Pat. Because he was very much kind of Aunt Pitty Pat, and so we called him Aunt Pitty Pat. And but there were, all kind of. I had a friend that I met actually before I met Flannery, but just before, and her name was Elizabeth Hester, and she was already corresponding with Flannery at that point, and her letters are the letters from A that. Sally didn't want to give her name, and so I knew Betty to the very end. I mean, we on the in Christmas of 1998, just before 1999, we took a Christmas dinner to Betty's house, and the house was sort of jumble, and it looked like one of those killers out west, who lived in blankets and all this kind of stuff, and cats. She had 6 cats. So but we went to see her and brought her something to eat. She really hadn't eaten for some time, and then there was Christmas dinner, and then we chatted, and she said I should have known. Well, actually, I was parked in the car, but she gave to Jenny, my wife. She said, "Look, here are my manuscripts," and they were in the same envelope that Iris Murdoch had sent them in from Oxford, and I had the same things. And I want Billy to have them. So so we did, and we spent the whole day with her. My son, who is she liked very much Eric, and so and we looked after her and saw her, and then said goodbye. And that night she shot herself and killed herself. And then we were called in. That was something like a Friday night, maybe, or it might have been Saturday. And then 2 days later, a day later, or they called us in, and we went over there, and and the house was an utter mess. The police had taken the body, but there was blood everywhere. And my wife and I cleaned up that room, and all the books and everything. And I'd asked her that afternoon, but I said, "I know you're a friend of Iris Murdoch's, as well as Flannery." By then, the habit of being had come out. And I said, "Well, where are the Murdoch letters?" And she said, they're in the books, it's coming. So that meant that my wife and I had to go through every book of about 1,000, 2,000, maybe book in the place, to go through, and all that dust, and they had not cleaned up the blood, the cats, all of this, and get those letters, which are interesting, and I have them. There are letters they're in the Emory Library right now. They're not given to Emory, but I have them. So anyway, finish up. Which is, I'm talking to her, Flannery O'Connor. She was light, she was joking, and we never argued on anything. Now, in letters, we might argue and have some problems, and there were, but Flannery, in a sense, Flannery was hard on everybody in letters. I mean, if you think any of you in here feel superior, believe me, you wouldn't feel superior long.
Yeah. Let me ask the obvious question that so many people ask when they first read a Flannery O'Connor story. Many people say, why this obsession with the grotesque? Why write such kind of depressing stories? I mean, isn't this person supposed to be a Catholic author, a religious believer? And I know that this is something that you've all grappled with and written on. Let me get your different perspectives on the answer to that question. Christina, you want to go first?
As I've mentioned before, and in my own work on Flannery O'Connor, it's vitally important for her as a Christian writer to say, this is the world the way it is. And people can't see the world the way it is, which is to say, the creation is good, but fallen. And so some aspect of that is not visible to people for whatever reason. And usually it's the fact of the fallenness that's not visible. So the grotesque is to emphasize something, to exaggerate something in order for people to see it. So if there's an absence of good or evil in a situation, you've got to make it doubly so that people can see it for what it is. It's a recognition issue. So that's what I think.
Okay.
I think that's exactly right. I would modify what Christina said only in the following way. It is not only that the world cannot recognize its own fallenness, and therefore it has to be drawn by Flannery O'Connor, she said, in large and startling figures and with a megaphone raised to shout, but it's also goodness that's invisible, that's unrecognized.
I agree with that.
True.
Yes.
true goodness, which is to say complicated goodness, not obvious goodness. The hermaphrodite is a grotesque creature through and through.
Why don't you describe the background of that a little bit? Which character you're referring to?
Yeah, the hermaphrodite in her story we discussed this morning, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, is a grotesque creature. He has features of both genders. He is one who's been made into a spectacle. He has to earn his living by being a sideshow act where he will lift her, the skirt and show beneath the features that are both feminine and masculine. But in that grotesquerie, there is true beauty because he has embraced his condition. He's not complained about his condition. He's not made it into an excuse for his own bitter unbelief. And in a culture like ours, to be sexually disabled is to be accursed in the ultimate sense. Not for him, because of the way he's redeemed that grotesque condition into truly a beautiful thing. I was encouraging students at lunch along those lines to be sure to read a memoir of Mary Ann.
Along with Parker's Back.
Along with Parker's Back. In both cases you have goodness, truly grotesque and truly beautiful.
Bill? Yes, I mean that's exactly the point. The point is that hideousness may be a way of seeing beauty. That's all the way back to Oscar Wilde and the Romantics in general, but it has a special meaning here because what Flannery is after, which I think is very important for most people, is the living presence of evil. That is, the living presence of evil, the diabolical that is about, and how the diabolical is so mixed with other realities that you can't quite work it all out. And I think that's why I like the hermaphrodite story, because in an age in which everything is sexuality, any form of sexuality, we talk constantly, she gives us an ultimate story that says, okay, so what? In other words, here is the condition, here's the situation, and that's exactly what it is, and you work from there. But the point is that it's a mixture. Everything is a mixture. In other words, it's the fallen human being, as opposed to what was so 19th century from Browning, which is live on, the best is yet to come. You know, this progressivism that's on everything, and unfortunately tied into every political party is this whole idea of it's going to get better. It's going to get better. No, it isn't. And that's what she's saying. It's not going to get better. And so that kind of, which is very kind of un-American, is what has lasted. Robert Giroux said to me, he was 93 and would die within a short.
I explain who Robert Giroux is.
Robert Giroux was the editor, her editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and it's named for him. But anyway, he said to me, she grew. In other words, she grew as other writers had not, and this was the surprise for them, and surprise for him. But it's because of even more than Lowell or even Bishop, who were really the great giants of that time, and who were friends of hers, very devoted friends of hers, I might add, especially Elizabeth Bishop, and that kind of emphasis was what O'Connor could offer, is the idea that that it is not, that is in a story that has a moral effort to it, in a sense, you can move on and make discoveries about life in general. It's like a formula, but you can work it out from there. I think that's one reason why a lot of the Asians, particularly the Japanese, are very taken with her. She's very popular in Japan.
Well, if she had a great awareness of original sin and the fallen state of human beings, and could draw pictures of really appalling kinds of activities, it didn't lead her to be a kind of nihilistic realist, you know, and yet I guess for a lot of people it might be hard to see where is the happiness in Flannery O'Connor. You might see it in her person, but in her writing, how does it come through her work that she did believe in happiness?
I think her happiest story is the river. Some of you know that story. It ends with a young... Yes, it's a story about a young man who has been taken by a babysitter to a river preaching where an 18-year-old, obviously untrained, unseminary educated preacher, not unlike the ones we encountered in Temple of the Holy Ghost, stands amidst a river while preaching, and in the process of doing so, he asks the young boy who's been brought by his babysitter to this river preaching, would he like to be baptized? Because he says, then you'll count. You'll count. And of course in the South, everyone knows what that means. It means you will really matter. He knows he hasn't mattered at all. He's been reared by these secular New Yorker reading kind of parents to believe that he was made by a doctor named Sladewall. He can't recognize Jesus when he sees him figured on in a calendar on the wall of the babysitter. But he knows that he has not counted. He's not amounted to anything to his parents. He gets new toys by breaking the old ones. He says, the only thing I was taught not to do was not to wet the bed. In other words, no moral life, no religious life, nothing of real substance. He's just a nuisance, frankly, to his parents. They have to put up with, or rather get rid of him as often as they can in the hands of this babysitter. Well, this boy senses instantly of what it would mean to count. And so he's taken under the river. The baptismal words are pronounced on him, over him. He goes back home and sees the awful, truly nihilistic world, which he would be consigned to living in if he stayed there for good. And so lying on his back, looking up with his feet in the air, he has this moment of revelation that he ought to go back to the river. And there, to follow the logic, he's 4 years old, of any 4-year-old child, look, if I amount to so much for having stayed under the river so briefly, then, by extension, I will truly and lastingly amount to something if I stay under the river permanently. So that's not an act of suicide at all. That's not an act of nihilistic despair at all. That's an act of real hope. On the one hand, it's a horrible condemnation of his parents. But on the other hand, it's a truly joyful, happy ending in and through death. And of course, that's where all Christian joy comes from. Just one final word on the grotesque. The ugliest instrument in the history of humankind is the cross. What we're about to honor in the next season is the single ugliest event ever to have occurred. And yet, of course, therein lies the only beauty to be truly and finally known. And O'Connor gets that, and that's what the rest of the world doesn't get. That's the true happiness in her.
Did you?
Well, I only wanted to just agree with Ralph. I mean, I don't agree that the river is the happiest of O'Connor's stories.
I was wondering about that myself, actually.
I agree with the principle, and the way that I have often put it is that O'Connor understands that your physical death is by far not the worst thing that can happen to you. That there is joy in understanding true, having true self-knowledge, no matter when it occurs or how late in your life, even if just a split second before you die, you have a true sense of self-knowledge, and if that then is accompanied by a spiritual understanding, like in the artificial nigger, then that's a happy story to me.
What is that? So, what story would you consider the happiest?
Well, this title is horrible, The Artificial Nigger, I think is her happiest story because, the grandfather gets this true self-knowledge, and he then has a chance to show, that love to the grandson. I think Good Country People is happy too in that same kind of way.
We'll talk a little bit about Good Country People.
Well, Joy, who has renamed herself Hulga because she thinks she sees through to nothing, decides she's going to seduce this simple Bible salesman who turns out not to be a Bible salesman at all, but is just a horrible drifter who steals people's glass eyes and wooden legs, and he teaches her that, here's what your philosophy will actually look like, manly pointer, and he runs off with her wooden leg, and she's left up in the loft without the wooden leg, but having been brought to this place of really understanding that's what it means to believe in nothing, is to treat people like that. And that kind of true self-knowledge, I think, is the joy that Flannery O'Connor wants you to get from the stories.
But I think you've got to take that beyond the stories, all of them. If you go to the last stories, it's a little different, and you can find happiness there. But I think the quintessential, that parable that I read, Passing by the Dragon, is in The Violent Buried Away. At the end of The Violent Buried Away, Tarwater will be going back into the city, and he's made up his mind that he's going to go back, and that implies, as Flannery said she was going to write it, other things. In other words, he may be killed, he may not be killed, but in a sense it doesn't really matter. Okay, if you're that state, you're happy. I mean, you're balanced with where you are. You may not look for happy endings, but you're balanced. You know where you are, and I think that's what's interesting, though, is the last stories have all kinds of senses of where is how do you live with a life like what happens to O.J. and the back and with Ruby Turpin, and then of course even Judgment Day, what means death there. But what's very interesting, and this I have now worked through her unfinished novel, and I know a lot about the unfinished novel. It's a very interesting work, totally different, and it too has a kind of ending, a kind of sense of time, and the way that time moves and unravels through a series of characters. And so I think, in other words, the early stories are set in a certain way for knowing what is the happy man kind of thing. But I think Tarwater is the best one to end up with until you get to some of the final stories. In other words, I think the emphasis is on that passing by the dragon, the endurance and what has to be, which is a very old Western. I mean, it's in the Aeneid, the first passage of the Aeneid. Endure and keep yourself for better days. Durati et so forth. It's a passage there. And that came over into the early Christians very strongly.
He who endures to the end shall be saved.
Yeah, this is, and they were very aware of the Stoic background, but it's more than Stoicism. It's translated into a...
Many of our viewers may not have read Flannery O'Connor before, and so how would you suggest that they start off their journey into to understanding and to reading Flannery O'Connor?
I have my little solution, but it's not for everybody. If you're going to read one story to begin with, don't read A Good Man Is Hard to Find. The worst possible place to begin. I learned this when teaching at Wake Forest, when students would say, I had nightmares. 5 people get killed. And of course, I remind them of what Bill Sessions said this morning. Yeah, a lot of people get killed in O'Connor's fiction, but as you said, nobody gets hurt. So I have them all begin with Revelation.
And what's that about? Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a story about a woman who is a conventional Christian, what I would call a church-going atheist, because her Christianity is the background noise of her life. It's the muzak that goes on all the time. She can pick up and hum tunes from the radio evangelists. As she says, I do for the church. She's there on Wednesday night. She's a good Baptist potluck casserole. That's the holy casserole that we serve at our bad Eucharists. And she is a woman who is convinced that the world can be ordered according to a certain hierarchy. And that hierarchy consists of people who have owned property, who also own cattle, who also own large cars. In other words, it's the American success story is her means of ranking all of the people, and that's how she puts herself to sleep every night. She ranks the folks that she knows, and above all, she thanks God for making her who she is, Ruby Turpin. And that hierarchy gets overturned in a very wicked way, not by death, but by something worse than death. She first of all begins to have difficulty when she starts to remember there are black people. There's a black dentist in town, for example, who owns a large white house on a large farm, and he has a big red Cadillac. Well, what do you do with him when there are, as she says, white trash way down at the bottom? And she says, and they're blacks. Notice right along beside them, she doesn't call them blacks, of course, not below them, but just even with them. Meaning, of course, that blacks really can't help who and what they are. White trash really could do better, but don't. And so she winds up thanking God for not making her a black person. Doesn't use that word. And she says, but if he had said, okay, Ruby, you just got two places to choose, what are you going to choose? Being who you are or being a black person? She said, well, then make me a nigger, but make me like I am. The ultimate arrogance, the ultimate hubris, pride. And then, of course, she does that same kind of ranking in the doctor's waiting room according to the kind of shoes people wear. You can tell what class you belong to according to your shoes. And she ranks everyone in the office. But there is a young Wellesley student. Notice the place where Marriott Lee, one of her friends, went, and of course the alma mater of Hillary Rodham Clinton, who is a psychology and sociology major. Beware, beware. O'Connor was a psychology and sociology major, and she said, thank God it didn't take. It was like a bad inoculation. Well, this girl, she's all, as she says, broke out. She wears Girl Scout shoes. She clunks around. She's unfeminine, but she's an intellectual. She hears Ruby going through this litany of all the things she's thankful for and how God has made the world just as he ought to have made it and put her in this wonderful place where she is, until this girl flings that big, thick psychology, sociology textbook and strikes Ruby in the head with it, knocks her to the floor, pounces on top of her, and says, you go back to hell where you belong, you old warthog. And of course, that's the judgment that Ruby needs and that Ruby doesn't want to receive. And by the way, O'Connor doesn't vindicate the Wellesley student, who, by the way, is named Mary Grace. Flannery O'Connor changed her name. Her full name was Mary Flannery O'Connor. She did not want to be a Catholic writer named Mary O'Connor. That's more Catholic than the Pope. So she...
Sound like an Irish washwoman.
Yeah, like an Irish washwoman.
Yeah.
But this woman, the white trash woman, says she's going to wind up in an insane asylum. And of course she will. All she has is Wellesley brilliance that can be critical of Southern stupidity of a certain kind. Whereas Ruby, who at least is concerned about this word of judgment given her, finally at the end, I won't go through it, the whole of it, receives that judgment with tremendous revelation, the title, grace, when she discovers all of these souls now going up, not in her hierarchy, but going up into what is clearly purgatory, where their evils will be burned away, and she and her husband Claude are at the very end, where they are having their virtues burned away because their virtues are small virtues. So begin with that story. Then, in my view, read the letters.
Yes, I was just doing that myself. The letters are wonderful.
I tell my students, if you read a Flannery O'Connor letter per night, you'll save your soul. It is
all the way.
it is the best
Yes.
devotional reading of an undevotional kind you can ever. Funny, sometimes sad, sometimes acerbic, often acerbic, and sometimes very poignant. One letter she says, "I'm sick of being sick." In another letter she says, "Pray that the lupus don't finish me off too quick." That you get to watch her die. You get to watch her make a good death.
Bill, any suggestions from where to start, or
I have to
from where to start, or
I have to reveal a dirty little secret, and so I'll get your ears open clearly and so forth. I have never taught a course in Flannery O'Connor. I have never taught even, I guess I sat in on a story to help discussing a story once, but I have absolutely no experience in teaching Flannery O'Connor. Now I can teach you Milton, I can teach you Shakespeare, I can teach you some of Chaucer, not too well, but I can certainly teach you anything in John Donne, George Herbert. These are my expert things. But I've never taught Flannery O'Connor, and no one has asked me to teach Flannery O'Connor. So I remain blissfully ignorant of how that works out. But I have some ideas, of course.
I'm curious, those of you who know Flannery's own reading habits, who were the writers that she really admired and liked to read?
I'll take that on because I started my work on Flannery O'Connor by reading everything that she read. That was how I began my research. I mean, I read everything she wrote first. But then in the areas of theology, philosophy, aesthetics, or fiction, so if it was in her library, something that it was indicated that she had read, I read it. And through that, I learned that these neo-Thomist philosophers, working in the line of St. Thomas Aquinas, like Maritain and Gilson, were very important to her, and that they gave her a picture of Western philosophy that, though she constantly was joking about being an intellectual and not being an intellectual, being a hillbilly Thomist, and she was very smart and knew that stuff remarkably well. She knew her philosophy. And what she knew of it, she got through the neo-Thomists, which is a certain picture of philosophy post Descartes, which is a kind of like with the cogito ergo sum, that I think therefore I am, was the beginning of the end of Western civilization, right? To define yourself by that you are thinking as an individual as opposed to a person in a community is one of the great Western problems. And so that, I mean, I probably meant more for fiction, but I was just so struck by how much of that material she clearly absorbed from her own reading.
She absorbed a great deal always, even at GSCW in the years. And she had a standard curriculum there. I mean, she had the old-fashioned, what was called old historicism in the method of teaching. But Iowa was the great eye-opener because there she had Austin Warren, who was the Warren and Wellick were the founders of the New Criticism, and then she read tremendously there, especially the religious thing never faltered. That is, she would read all the French authors that we've talked about here. Yes, but also Bernanos, and also one after the other. And for example, Bernanos has marvelous passages on the devil, actual appearance of the devil. And this is something that she looked at, and because she was very conscious of the devil, the place of the devil, and the role of the devil, and this kind of thing. And this is why a lot of people, especially one Jesuit president that I recently talked to was horrified in general by hearing, namely this whole concentrating on something that was really a little outre for him. But the real thing that she had, for example, she read a great deal. She read, I have a whole theory of a relationship between, which I bring out in my analysis, of The Violet Buried Away and Catcher in the Rye. There's a real connection between the two. And she read Catcher in the Rye one whole afternoon and this kind of thing. So she read tremendously. I don't know whether she read Bellow, but yeah.
But she said, if you asked me who are my influences, she said, I would mutter Henry James. And then she said, but really, I am sad to say that my greater influences were things like the humorous tales of Edgar Allan Poe. And he probably wrote them all while drunk, too.
Caroline Gordon had a tremendous influence on her, obviously, and was the. I have a chapter that when she comes, after I've gotten her back, she's very sick, and then I start part 2, and it's called Two Healers. And the one healer is Merrill, Dr. Merrill, who was the one who discovered everything, and the other is Caroline Gordon. Because Caroline Gordon told her the things to read, how to read them, and she had enormous influence. People forget. She was not only Alan Tate's wife, but she was the Caroline Gordon who wrote the review of Cowley's Faulkner that established Faulkner in 1947. That was the New York Times Review's famous review. And because of that, Faulkner then began to move on ultimately to the Nobel Prize. But my point is that she was in touch, and you have to remember that Caroline Gordon herself was a convert, of course, and she had all these connections in France. Hemingway was her friend, Fitzgerald's, when I knew Caroline Gordon, I told her about an event that had just happened, which was when Zelda Fitzgerald, Scott Fitzgerald's wife, was burned alive in a sanatorium in North Carolina, right there.
Asheville.
Yeah, and she was horrified. I mean, this is. But what I'm trying to get to is, Flannery had close to her a number of major influences that opened up almost anything that she wanted to read. She was, of course, a tremendous reader. That was when she had the strength. Finally, the strength wasn't there.
She, of course, admired Conrad as well.
Tremendously.
More than,
Conrad's very important.
She said, I like Conrad's motto, my aim is to enable the reader to see.
Yeah.
To see.
Yeah.
And of course, to see not only what is there, but what is invisible.
See, and that is everything.
Yeah. The Conrad influence is neglected, I think, because it was a tremendous influence. I mean, how do you get Conrad into Violet Buried Away? Well, you can. It's a question of seeing how all that can work out. But
there's one other book, actually, that she attributed tremendous influence to, and that she revealed it at a book club. And we are in the sponsorship of a local book club. And at that book club, I discovered, by the way, book clubs are often places where people go to talk about books they haven't read. But at this book club, ladies were all going around the room declaring what had been the major literary influences on their lives. And they were all trying to outdo each other. You know, the plays of Shakespeare, you know, the works of Marlowe, everything that Melville wrote, Hawthorne, etc. And finally came Flannery O'Connor's term. She says, the most important book in my life was the Sears and Roebuck catalog.
One question I find interesting is why it is that people are attracted to Flannery O'Connor. I mean, in some ways, it's easier for me to see how people who have some kind of a Catholic or Christian sensibility would be attracted to her, because however strange many of the stories are, there's clearly this underlying sensitivity to the big religious questions. I wonder, though, you know, so many of the well-established writers of her time knew her and admired her. And they did not share those sensibilities, and yet they respected her. I'm kind of curious, what was it there about her and her writing that fascinated them or intrigued them?
Well, for Lowell and Bishop, it was how well she wrote, and also the humor and the style and everything. And they took the Catholic. Well, of course, Lowell had a Catholic deal. You know, I mean, he was a Catholic and out of the Catholic, and died in a high Anglican service, etc. But the point is that with Caroline Gordon, not Caroline Gordon, but the Elizabeth Bishop, who is a good example of her admiration for the work itself. And I think that's sort of where you start with all these people. For example, Saul Billow's son told me, I was talking to him because they were considering my manuscript, a place where he is Viking, I think. And he said, oh, I admire her, I admire Flannery O'Connor very much. You know, that this is a tremendous, and these are people who have no religious sense at all. I mean, that they do not, I mean, they may or may not, but it has nothing to do with it. And I think that's the way Flannery would like it, if you ask me. I mean, Flannery wanted to be seen first as a good writer.
Yeah, Alfred Kazin, one of the great New York Jewish critics, wrote a review of their last volume of short stories. He said about Parker's Back, that story comes as close to being an absolutely perfect story as has ever been written. And he added, for that person to be dead at 39 is an unthinkable thought. Along the same lines, they admire the enormous mastery of her craft called fiction. We were learning last night, Professor Lensing here at Chapel Hill, that fewer and fewer places, fewer and fewer departments of English, I should say, at highfalutin schools are teaching O'Connor, but all of the creative writing programs everywhere are teaching her for the reason we've heard both Christina and Bill.
About Parker's Back, when I read that story and studied it and worked on it, I just thought, Lord, how could you take her away right after she completed this story? Because she was growing, and I think we would have seen some
But it
amazing,
was her last story.
Yeah, her very last one, written on her deathbed, and she would make some sort of joke about how the doctor would say, you know, you're not working or anything, and she would say something like, just writing, you know. But brilliant. And I mean, the passage that you read, the very first paragraph of Temple of the Holy Ghost, shows the skill. I start my class in Flannery O'Connor with the displaced person, and we read the first paragraph, same thing. It's, you read the one paragraph and you know why people continue to read her. Brilliant. To read her. Brilliant.
But she learned tremendously from everybody, including Ring Lardner, and Iowa was a marvelous place for her because she had all kinds of reading they led her to, but on the other hand, she could work out a variety of things, and she was working out her own sense of who she was. That's why she wrote the prayer journal. Now, after the prayer, you don't have a prayer journal again, or anything like that, because you have Wise Blood, you have Tar Water, you have the Parker's Back, you have that. But it really is interesting that she's still having the direct passages, I think, between the prayer journal and or the Journal of Prayers, as I like to call it, and the Wise Blood. And Wise Blood was begun in Thanksgiving of 1946, I guess, yeah. And so it really was at a certain time.
But published in 52, that tells you everything.
Yeah.
6 years of writing, rewriting.
Steady, every day.
Hundreds of pages.
Well, I wish we could go on and on. There's so much to talk about Flannery O'Connor, but we're hoping that this at least gives you a taste of Flannery and why it is that you might want to read her. And we hope that many other people will be introduced to her by the panel discussion today and by the wonderful work that all these people have done on her. So again, this is Christopher Wolfe from the Thomas International Center, bidding you a good afternoon.